Hello, I want to give you a quick overview of Chapter 3, the British Atlantic World. This is starting the beginning of Period 2 within our notes, and so I wanted to give a good overview of what was going on with the Atlantic coastal colonies up till almost the time of the French and Indian War. All right, so after the three different regions were established: New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. Uh, in the middle colonies, there were some that were established that were proprietorships. They were given to families, individuals to run as a private corporation, basically. So, the Carolinas, for example, South Carolina was granted to planters so that they could run that as a profitable plantation colony. Pennsylvania was established for Quakers. It was a place for them to be free from persecution, but they also opened the door for other people to come in and settle. Uh, they were unique in the sense that they paid Native Americans for the land when they got there. So William Penn was granted the land by the king, but when he arrived in Pennsylvania, he purchased the territory from Native Americans. And Quakers always had a wonderful relationship with Native Americans. And while William Penn was alive, Pennsylvania had no trouble with Native Americans. Um, you did have some problems with the British mercantilist system. The official line was that the colonies had to trade with Great Britain alone. They had to ship things to Britain on British ships and only trade with the mother country. That's what these navigation acts were. So, it was to crack down on illegal activities in the colonies, but they were very sporadically enforced. So basically, up until almost the time of the Revolution, the laws were on the books that said that the colonists couldn't smuggle things in, but they did anyway. There was a brief attempt in the late 1600s, the 1680s, to kind of establish some colonial unity. It was imposed on them by the British. This was called the Dominion of New England. The idea was is that you were going to combine these colonies together for administrative purposes, to help defend against Native American attacks, to help defend against other European attacks, to sort of streamline the whole process of governing the colonies. It always met with resistance. They didn't like it. And so as soon as the Glorious Revolution happened and King James II was overthrown, all of this was basically taken away. So, but there were some attempts at colonial unity. It was imposed, though, largely from the outside, and it just didn't work. With this Glorious Revolution, you have the Stuart King James II overthrown. Parliament invites James's daughter and his son-in-law to come back and be the rulers of England. What this does is sets in motion this idea that there is a representative part of the government that has to be listened to. So Parliament becomes the dominant governing body in the United Kingdom. And the Americans are kind of paying attention to this. So this is something that down the road is going to come back, and they're going to revive this idea, even though the British sort of forgot about it. There was a brief rebellion against this Dominion of New England called Leisler's Rebellion. It was put down. But again, like most rebellions in the colonies, it basically is a rebellion of the have-nots against the haves. So you almost always see that with Bacon's rebellion. Is the same type of situation. People who felt like they weren't getting a fair representation. Excuse me, I'm about to sneeze. They fought back. So, they were suppressed, but that doesn't mean, though, that the reasons why that was brought about in the first place went away. Um, Native Americans were, and we mentioned this within the last period, um, they were involved with trade with Europeans. They were trying their best to maintain their independence with the various European groups. Um, the Iroquois, as we mentioned last time, were very powerful and were able to maintain this balance, particularly between the English and the French, and maintain trade relations and be quite powerful. Slavery is becoming even more of a factor within colonial life during this time period. A lot of importation of slaves continues in the Caribbean. Barbados, which is the place where a lot of people that settled in the Carolinas were originally from, brought their slave code with them. And so the ideas of the Caribbean slave economy start to come into the southern part of the United States. There's a lot of wealth that's being generated here. I mean, not just for the colonies, but also for the mother country. The trade in human beings was quite lucrative. Most of the people that were being brought over from Africa were males. It is interesting, though, that there are current studies that show that most African Americans, though, are descended from African females. So that brings into play a lot of the things that were going on with African women, and how African women were being exploited with their labor and with their sexuality. So this was just an awful situation. In the Chesapeake and in South Carolinas, which is where most slaves were located, it's largely because of changing economics in England. They need the labor. They need people that are identifiable as labor. So they start cracking down on imported African slaves and creating even more rigid codes that govern their behaviors. So, they start to change the definition of slavery to chattel slavery, where a person's descendants also are going to be slaves too. One of the things that does happen with slavery in the United States is that they were purposely separated. They deliberately bought people from different parts of Africa so that they could not speak the same language and could not cooperate with one another. The reality, though, is that these people were quite resilient. And so they did start to develop an African culture that was influenced by their American experience. So unique musical forms, food forms, language forms start to develop. There is a lot of resistance that takes place. Normally it's through work slowdowns and through running away. Although, there were rebellions. The Stono Rebellion that took place in 1739 in South Carolina resulted in, a lot of slaves trying to escape to Florida to be free. But it also caused a lot of crackdowns throughout the colonies. You start to see plantation owners in the South beginning to develop this culture of gentility, that they are a little bit better than other people, and so you start to see the idea of the plantation with the master and the mistress of the plantation and the porches with the mint juleps. You start to see those types of things at play. So very few people were that wealthy. Most people in the South were small farmers and continued to struggle, and most of them were not slave owners. In the North, you have in New England a maritime economy, so people are farming, but they're also involved with either shipbuilding or trade. So there's a lot of trade going back and forth from the Caribbean to New England, and then shipping things over to England, particularly with rum production. A lot of fishing, a lot of shipbuilding's going on. New England also tended to be more urban. So more people lived in towns. There also was a more diversity of types of occupations. So people weren't just farmers, although that was the largest group. You had a lot of other people that were in the mix as well. You see the rise of colonial assemblies. So every colony had their own assembly of landowners. They had varying degrees of the ability to vote and who could hold office, but that is something that was across the board. So usually the elites ran things, but almost always you had some sort of representation of even the average common person to some degree. There was a lot of what's called salutary neglect. This kind of goes back to the navigation laws, where they were on the books, but they just didn't enforce them. England pretty much left the colonies alone because the colonies were profitable and they had their hands full with civil wars and rebellions and religious struggles. So they tended to leave the colonies alone. Um, they did, though, use the colonies to further British imperial goals. So Georgia, for example, was established to provide a buffer between the Carolinas and Spain. And the colonies were very involved with this. I mean, it was a disadvantage to be in the mercantilist system, but it also was an advantage. For one thing, the colonists were under the British flag. So, they're growing in population. So they're becoming a larger and larger part of the British economy. And so they're a very, very important part to this whole imperial idea that's going on. Although there wasn't a whole lot of money in the colonies because all the gold and silver pretty much went back to Britain. So one of the things the colonists always struggled with was having enough money, enough cash. So a few things to remember. Know that Pennsylvania was established by Quakers. There was a religious motivation for establishment, a lot of toleration. Know what the navigation acts are. Be familiar with that whole transatlantic triangular trade situation. Sugar production, slavery, rum production, finished goods coming from Europe back to the Americas and Africa. Um, be familiar with slavery in both Chesapeake and with the Carolinas. Be familiar with some of the slave rebellions, particularly the Stono Rebellion. Salutary neglect, what that is. Understand that most of the conflicts that involved North America involved controlling land, and that the colonists were pretty good about avoiding British laws and getting out of trouble, at least up to the 1750s. Okay, so thank you. If there's any questions, just ask me, and I'll see you in the next chapter.